The desert and no country for old men does not feel empty. It feels patient. It is the kind of place where one bad decision does not stay small for long. Heat strips away comfort, distance kills illusions, and violence moves through the land like something older than law. Sheriff Anton Bell understands that better than most men. He has spent his life wearing a badge, watching the world change into something colder, stranger, and harder to recognize. He speaks softly, thinks deeply, and carries the sadness of a man who no longer knows whether decency still has a fighting chance. While Bell reflects on the nature of evil, another story begins far from his office. Llewellyn Moss is out hunting antelope in the Texas scrub, moving carefully through rock and dry grass, with the patience of a man who trusts his eyes more than luck. Then he stumbles onto the aftermath of a drug deal gone wrong. There are trucks scattered across the desert, broken bodies, bullet holes, heroin in the vehicles, blood in the sand. Everyone is dead except for one dying man asking for water in a voice already halfway gone. Moss keeps moving through the scene like he is reading a crime from the inside out. He finds the drugs. He finds the casings. He finds the final trail that leads a little farther away from the trucks. And then he finds the money. A case packed with $2 million lies hidden in the shade near the last corpse. No witnesses. No police. No second thoughts loud enough to stop him. Moss looks at the cash and makes the choice that defines the rest of the story. Takes Italiano. That is the moment the film locks into place. Moss believes he can live with the consequences of one dangerous decision if he stays calm enough and moves fast enough. At first, it almost works. He brings the money home, hides it, and tells his wife Carla Jean that they need to leave town immediately. He does not tell her everything, because half of him is already pretending that this can still become a clean escape instead of the beginning of a nightmare. But Moss cannot stop thinking about the dying man in the desert asking for water. Late that night, he goes back with a jug, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of some stubborn piece of conscience. That small return seals his fate more than taking the money did, because by the time he comes back, other men are already arriving at the scene. Trucks move in the dark. Guns appear. Moss barely escapes with his life, chased across the desert by people who now know someone walked away with something that belongs to them. He reaches home alive, but the world has already shifted. The money is no longer just money. It is a signal. A scent. A decision that will now pull violence toward him no matter where he goes. And one of the things it pulls toward him is Anton Chigurh. Chigurh is not written like an ordinary hit. He is something quieter and far more disturbing. He does not rage. He does not posture. He does not need to perform violence, because violence lives comfortably inside him. His face stays almost empty. His voice barely rises. He carries a captive bolt pistol like a tool from some industrial nightmare and moves through the world with the calm of someone who never questions whether other people should die. At the start of the film, Chigurh is arrested for an unrelated matter, and even in custody he feels wrong, as if the bars and handcuffs belong to a weaker story than the one he is actually part of. He strangles a deputy to death with his own cuffs. Then he steps outside, kills a driver with eerie calm, and begins moving toward the missing money like fate has given itself a body. If you enjoy dark movie stories like this, subscribe to Cinema Trigger, leave a like, and comment the next film you want covered, because this is not just a chase thriller. It is a story about choice, consequence, and a kind of evil that feels impossible to reason with. Sheriff Bell starts investigating the massacre in the desert and quickly realizes the case is bigger than one bad deal. Drugs, money, multiple shooters, moving targets. The violence is organized, but the aftermath feels chaotic enough to swallow anyone trying to understand it too late. Bell is good at reading the human side of crime. He knows fear, greed, and desperation when he sees them. What unsettles him here is the scale, the coldness, and the feeling that every step behind the killers puts him further into a world he no longer knows how to stop. Moss, meanwhile, begins trying to stay ahead. He sends Carla Jean away to her mother for safety and holes up in motels, changing locations, checking windows, carrying weapons, and sleeping in fragments. The film never turns him into a superhero. Moss is capable, alert, and brave under pressure, but he's still just a man trying to outmaneuver forces far more ruthless than he expected. The money case contains a tracking device. That detail changes everything. It means Moss is not just being searched for in general. He is being followed precisely, methodically, and by people who know patience better than panic. At one motel, Chigurh tracks him to the room next door. He removes his boots, sits in silence, and waits. The tension in No Country for Old Men often comes from stillness rather than action. Death may already be in the hallway, and the first sign of it will arrive 1 second too late. Moss realizes someone is near. He switches off the light, waits, then dives through a window as bullets tear through the room. What follows is not a flashy action scene. It is brutal, cramped, and exhausting. Two men feel each other out in darkness, trading instinct, pain, and survival one narrow move at a time. Moss escapes again, wounded but alive. That matters because each survival makes the chase feel less like a simple manhunt and more like a contest between human will and something almost mythic. Moss is clever enough to keep living. Chigurh is relentless enough to make survival feel temporary. The people who lost the money are not only trusting Chigurh, they also send Carson Wells, another professional killer, to retrieve the case. Wells is smoother than Chigurh, more social, more recognizable as a man who works in violence for money rather than principle. He finds Moss in a hospital after the motel shootout and offers a warning. The money is not the real problem anymore. Chigurh. Wells tells Moss that once Chigurh starts coming, compromise stops being realistic. Moss refuses to surrender. Maybe out of pride. Maybe because backing down now feels too close to dying on someone else's terms. He thinks movement and nerve can still save him. Bell keeps tracing the wreckage behind them all. He arrives at crime scenes too late. Hotel rooms half spoiled by violence. Roads where blood has already dried into silence. Ober, he finds himself one step behind Chigurh. Almost close enough to understand him. Never close enough to stop him. This gap becomes one of the film's most haunting patterns. Bell is not lazy. He's simply moving inside an older moral framework. One where evil might still be caught, punished, and explained. Chigurh belongs to something colder. One of the film's most famous scenes makes that clear. Chigurh visits a gas station and begins talking to the owner in a way that feels ordinary at first, then quietly terrifying. Every question sounds casual. Every pause feels loaded. The man behind the counter slowly realizes he is standing near a danger he cannot define. Then Chigurh flips a coin. He tells the man to call it. The scene is unforgettable because it shows how Chigurh thinks. He acts like chance is sacred, like fate is a structure he merely delivers. He places life and death inside rituals that make him feel less like a killer making choices and more like a force revealing what was always going to happen. That philosophy is monstrous because it empties responsibility while pretending to honor destiny. Chigurh kills people, but he talks as if the coin or the moment made the decision long before he arrived. Carson Wells eventually tracks Chigurh to Moss's trail as well. For a moment, it seems possible that two experienced killers in the same story might balance each other out, or at least create a clash that slows the nightmare down. Instead, Chigurh kills Wells with humiliating ease. He does it calmly, almost dismissively, as if removing an obstacle from a path that was never really contested. Then he calls Moss and makes the threat even more personal. If Moss does not give up the money, Kala Zhang will pay for it. That threat changes the emotional center of the story. Up to this point, Moss is mostly gambling with his own life. Now the choice he made in the desert starts spreading its cost outward. This is no longer only about survival, pride, or escape. It is about who gets dragged into the consequences of one man deciding he could carry a case full of blood money and still keep his world intact. Moss tries to arrange a deal, thinking he can still control part of the chaos if he moves smartly enough. But No Country for Old Men is a story that keeps punishing the belief that skill can guarantee control. Bell speaks to Carla Jean and tries, in his own careful way, to offer protection. He is deeply aware of how much danger she is in, but he also knows the limits of what law can do once someone like Chigurh has decided to keep moving. That awareness feeds Bell's growing despair. He's spent decades believing that experience teaches a man how to face darkness. What he now confronts is darkness that does not care how old, honorable, or prepared he is. Moss makes it to a motel near the border and seems poised for another desperate move. Then the film makes one of its boldest choices. He dies. Off-screen, Bell arrives too late again and finds only the aftermath. Moss, who seemed like the central force of the chase, is gone. shot by Mexican gang members who enter the story like another wave of violence breaking over the same ruined shore. That choice shocks people because movies usually reward the character we have followed so closely with a showdown, a final decision, or at least the dignity of a visible death. No Country for Old Men denies that expectation completely. Moss does not die in a grand cinematic moment. He dies because violence in this world is not interested in narrative fairness. That is one of the reasons the film feels so unsettling. It does not shape death into satisfying drama. It lets death arrive bluntly, off-screen, without asking whether the audience was emotionally ready for it. Bell goes into the motel room afterward, sees the wreckage, and feels the case slipping beyond him. He is not just losing to Chigurh. He is losing to a world in which his instincts about order, courage, and justice seem less useful every hour. Still, one final piece remains unresolved. Carla Jane Chigurh goes to her after Moss's death because he promised he would. That promise matters to him in the twisted code he follows. What matters is that he said what would happen, and now the world must be bent to keep the structure intact. Carla Jean is one of the few people in the film who speaks to Chigurh without trying to bargain through bravado or fantasy. She is frightened, yes, but clear-eyed. She sees the emptiness in his coin toss ritual for what it is. When Chigurh tells her to call the coin, she refuses. She tells him the choice is his. That moment is powerful because it cuts through his philosophy. He wants fate to carry the burden. Carla Jean refuses to help him dress murder up as destiny. If she dies, it is because he chooses it, not because a coin or the universe decided for him. The film never explicitly shows the killing, but the implication is unmistakable. Chigurh leaves the house, checks his boots, the way he always does after bloodshed, and walks away. Then, for the first time in the entire film, chance touches him directly. At an intersection, another car slams into his vehicle. Bone pierces skin. Blood appears. The unstoppable force suddenly looks mortal. Even then, he keeps moving. Children approach. He buys a shirt from one of them to use as a sling. He walks away injured but alive. Not triumphant exactly, but unchanged in essence. The world can wound him. It still cannot explain him. That final escape matters because it denies the audience one more conventional comfort. Chigurh is not caught. Bell does not outthink him. The law does not close around him. Evil does not receive its neat ending. Instead, the film turns fully toward Bell. After everything, Bell retires. Not because he is weak, but because he understands that there's a point where honest exhaustion becomes impossible to hide. The violence he has seen is no longer something he can place inside a framework that lets him keep believing. His work still means what it once meant. In the film's final scene, Bell sits at the breakfast table, describing two dreams about his father. In one dream, he loses money and knows his father would be disappointed. In the second, his father rides ahead through a mountain pass in the dark, carrying fire in a horn to make a place for Bell further up the trail. Then Bell wakes up. That ending is one of the most haunting in modern cinema because it refuses to conclude the plot in the ordinary sense. Instead, it concludes the feeling. Bell is left with memory, age, failure, and the faint image of someone older carrying light into darkness ahead of him. No Country for Old Men is not really about whether the money gets recovered. It is not even finally about whether Chigurh lives or dies. It is about what happens when the world stops resembling the moral language you were raised to trust. Bell believes in decency, in law, in patient courage. The film does not mock those things, but it does show their limits in a world where violence is faster, colder, and less interested in making sense than the men assigned to stop it. Moss represents another response to that world. He believes that if a man is tough enough, smart enough, and willing enough to act, he can still carve out his own fate. The film punishes that belief too. Competence helps him survive for a while, but competence is not the same as control. And Chigurh represents something worse than evil in the ordinary sense. He represents evil stripped of vanity. He does not want admiration. He does not need audience approval. He kills because killing fits the logic he has chosen to live by. And that logic is almost impossible to negotiate with because it has already emptied him out. That is why he feels so terrifying. Most killers in films still feel human in their weaknesses, desires, or emotional bursts. Chigurh Feels like conviction without humanity. The title itself matters more the longer you sit with the story. No Country for Old Men sounds at first like a line about age, but it is really about displacement. Bell feels that the world has shifted into something his generation no longer recognizes. Not because violence never existed before, but because the shape of it feels different now. The film never fully confirms whether Bell is right about that. Maybe the world was always this brutal. Maybe he's only old enough now to feel the weight of brutality more personally. Maybe what has changed is not evil itself, but his ability to keep facing it. That ambiguity gives the film its depth. Bell's despair is real, but so is his nostalgia. And nostalgia can sometimes turn the past into a cleaner place than it ever really was. Even so, the story does not make his fear feel foolish. It makes it human. He looks at the violence around him and sees not just a case, but a future where the old words duty, justice, courage still matter. Morally, yet no longer guarantee anything practical. That tension is what makes the film feel so heavy after it ends. It is not only the violence. It is the idea that goodness may still exist while losing its power to shape events. And yet, the film is not empty. Bell's final dream matters because it suggests that meaning may survive even where certainty does not. The father, carrying fire through darkness, is not a solution. It is not an arrest, a victory, or a restored world. It is smaller than that and somehow deeper. The idea that someone went ahead into the cold and made a place for you anyway. That image lingers against everything Chigurh represents. And maybe that is the film's quietest argument. Evil can move through the world with terrifying force, and still there remains some human instinct to carry light for one another, even if only briefly, even if only in memory. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Cinema Trigger, leave a like, and comment the next movie you want covered, because the darkest stories are not always about who pulls the trigger. Sometimes they are about the moment a person realizes the world has become harder than their old moral map can explain and keeps walking anyway.